The woman stood at the creek's edge, hands bound behind her back, staring at the muddy water like it might offer salvation. Blood traced a slow line from the cut above her eyebrow down to her jaw, dark against skin already darkened by sun and suffering. She was tall, taller than any woman Ezra Brennan had ever seen, broad-shouldered and built like she'd been carved from the same oak that lined the Montana hills. Her height alone would have drawn stares in any town, but it was the way she carried it that held his attention now. Not with shame or apology, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd long ago stopped explaining herself to a world that wouldn't understand anyway. Three men on horseback circled her slow, their laughter cutting through the late August wind like the crack of a whip. One of them held such a whip, letting it uncoil and test the air with practiced menace. Another spat tobacco and grinned with teeth gone brown from years of poor choices and poor hygiene. The third just watched with eyes flat as creek stones. The kind of eyes that belonged to a man who'd stopped feeling much of anything a long time ago, and that made him the most dangerous of all. Sister Abigail Thorne didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't give them the satisfaction of breaking. The rope burns raw on her wrist told Ezra she'd been their captive for days and exhaustion pulled at every muscle in her frame. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There was something in how she stood, in the set of her jaw, and the way her dark eyes tracked each movement of her captors, that spoke of calculations being made of patience, being practiced of a warrior waiting for the right moment rather than the desperate moment. Ezra sat on his horse 50 yards uphill, hidden by the cottonwoods that lined the bank. He'd come down from his trapping territory to check the water levels, see if the spring runoff had damaged any of the beaver dams he'd been monitoring. Instead, he'd found this: a woman being tormented by three men who looked like they'd crawled out of hell's back door and decided they liked the taste of cruelty enough to make it a regular habit. He recognized one of them immediately. Clayton Mercer, maybe 42 years old, face carved with scars from some war he'd fought and lost in ways that had nothing to do with battles and everything to do with what war does to a man's soul. Clayton had worked briefly for the Whitmore spread before getting fired for stealing horses. That had been 2 years back. Clearly, the intervening time hadn't improved his character. The other two were strangers, but their type was painfully familiar. Drifters, men who took what they wanted and left ruins behind. Men who'd stopped seeing other people as humans somewhere along the way and started seeing them as things to be used or discarded based on convenience and whim. The woman stumbled when Clayton yanked her forward by the rope. She didn't cry out, didn't beg for mercy. She knew wouldn't come. She just found her footing and stood there, breathing hard through her nose, those dark eyes never leaving her tormentor's face. Clayton circled her again, the whip uncoiling like a snake testing the air before a strike. "You're too damn big to be any use," he said, voice carrying across the water, with the casual cruelty of a man who'd said such things so many times they'd become reflex. "Can't fit you in a wagon, can't sell you to a house in town, hell can't even find clothes that'd cover those arms. What are we supposed to do with you?" The woman said nothing. Her silence seemed to make him angrier, the way silence always enrages men who need fear to feel powerful. He raised the whip. Ezra's hand moved to the Winchester rifle across his saddle before his mind caught up with his body. His jaw tightened. He'd spent 4 years trying to mind his own business, trying to build something quiet on land that had seen too much blood already. He'd buried his wife Margaret and his daughter Ruth in this soil. Sworn to himself he was done with violence, done with other people's wars, done with the kind of involvement that led to caring and caring that led to loss. But there were lines a man couldn't ignore. Not if he wanted to live with himself after. Not if he wanted to look in a mirror without seeing a coward staring back. The whip cracked through the air. The woman flinched but didn't fall. A red line appeared across her shoulder, visible through the torn fabric of what had once been a shirt. Might have been white once. Now it was the color of dust and blood and days without mercy. Clayton laughed and wound up for another strike. Ezra squeezed his horse forward, breaking through the tree line. The sound of hooves on stone made all three men turn as one. Clayton's hand froze mid-swing. The man with the flat eyes reached for his revolver but didn't draw it. Not yet. The mathematics of the situation were still being calculated. "That's close enough," the flat-eyed man said. His voice matched his eyes, empty of inflection, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd killed before and would do it again without losing sleep. Professional, cold, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with practice. Ezra stopped his horse 10 feet away. He kept the Winchester loose in his grip, not aiming, but not setting it down either. His eyes moved from man to man, cataloging weapons and positions and angles of fire. Then he looked at the woman. She stared back with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue, just a weary curiosity watching to see what kind of man he was. Whether he'd ride past like so many others had, or whether he'd prove different. Her expression suggested she'd long ago stopped betting on different. "You boys got business here?" Ezra asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight the way voices do when they belong to men who don't need to shout to be heard. "Private business," Clayton said, recovering his swagger now that the initial surprise had passed. He gestured at the woman with his whip. "Found her wandering 3 days back. She's ours now." "She got a name?" "Hell if I know. She don't talk much." Ezra's eyes never left the woman. "That true, you don't talk." For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly, carefully she spoke. Her voice was damaged from lack of water, rough as creek gravel, but clear and steady beneath the roughness. "My name is Sister Abigail Thorne." The sound of her own name seemed to surprise her, like she hadn't spoken it aloud in a very long time. Like she'd forgotten what it felt like to claim her own identity in front of others. Clayton's face darkened. He raised the whip again. "Nobody told you to speak." The crack of Ezra's Winchester cut him off. The bullet kicked up dirt 3 inches from Clayton's boot, close enough that pebbles struck leather. All three men froze. The flat-eyed one's hand was on his revolver, now fingers curled around the grip, but not drawing. Not yet. The mathematics were clear and brutal. Ezra had the rifle already aimed. By the time any of them cleared leather, at least one would be dead. Maybe two. The flat-eyed man looked like he was doing the calculations, weighing profit against cost, and the numbers weren't adding up the way he'd like. "I think your business here is finished," Ezra said. Clayton's face went red, the kind of red that spoke of fury barely contained. "You got no right." "I got every right. This is my land you're standing on. Creek runs through my property for half a mile either direction. That makes this my business." It was a lie. The creek was open range, belonged to no one and everyone. But the lie was delivered with such flat certainty that doubt flickered across Clayton's face. He wasn't sure, and uncertainty was a crack Ezra could work with. The flat-eyed man studied Ezra for a long moment, weighing odds and outcomes with the cold precision of someone who'd survived by making smart choices in bad situations. Then he nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "Let's go," he said to the others. Clayton sputtered. "We spent 3 days tracking her down. 3 days in the heat and the dust, and now you want to just walk away because some mountain man with a rifle says so." "I said, let's go." The flat-eyed man's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It just became more final, the way a door sounds when it closes for the last time. He turned his horse and started riding north. The third man, the one who'd been silent through all of this, followed immediately. His relief was visible in the sudden looseness of his shoulders, the way he didn't look back. A young man, maybe 24, who'd gotten himself into something darker than he'd bargained for, and was grateful for the excuse to leave. Clayton hesitated, knuckles white, around the whip handle. Then he spat in Abigail's direction, a final act of petty cruelty, and yanked his horse around, kicking it hard to catch up with the others. Ezra watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower the Winchester. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. His hands wanted to shake, but he wouldn't let them. Not yet. Not while she was watching. Sister Abigail Thorne stood motionless, hands still bound, blood still trickling from the cut above her eye. She watched Ezra with that same careful, measuring gaze, not grateful, not relieved, just watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Waiting to see if he was the kind of man who saved you from one danger, only to become a different kind of danger himself. Ezra dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. He pulled his knife from his belt and approached her. She didn't flinch when he moved behind her to cut the ropes. The bindings fell away, revealing deep purple bruises circling both wrists, the kind that came from struggling against restraints for hours or days. She brought her hands forward slowly, flexing her fingers as circulation returned, with 1,000 needle pricks of pain she didn't acknowledge. "You hurt anywhere else?" Ezra asked. She touched the cut on her forehead, then looked at the blood on her fingertips with something like mild curiosity, as if it belonged to someone else. Nothing that won't heal. Her voice was stronger now. It held an accent he couldn't quite place, something that suggested she'd learned English from multiple sources, piecing together words from different teachers, different worlds. You got somewhere to go. She looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head once. A simple gesture that contained multitudes of loss and displacement and doors that had closed behind her. Ezra sighed. He'd known that was coming, known it the moment he had fired that warning shot. My camp is 3 miles north. Got water, food, and shelter if you need a place to rest. Why? The question was direct, unadorned. No gratitude, no false modesty, just a request for explanation. She wanted to know his reasons before she accepted his help. Smart, careful, the behavior of someone who'd learned that help often came with prices that weren't named until the bill came due. Because those men will come back, Ezra said. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come back and they'll be angrier. You need time to heal, time to figure out your next move. Abigail studied him, her dark eyes moving across his face like she was reading a map, looking for lies, for hidden intentions, for the catch that always came with offers of help. Ezra met her gaze steadily. He had nothing to hide. His reasons were simple, even if they dredged up memories he'd rather leave buried. Finally, Abigail nodded. 3 miles north. 3 miles north, Ezra confirmed. He mounted his horse and extended his hand down. She looked at it for a moment, weighing trust against necessity, then gripped his forearm. Her hands were enormous, her grip like iron. Ezra pulled, and despite her size, she swung up behind him with surprising grace. The kind of grace that came from a body that knew how to move, how to balance, how to survive. The horse shifted under the added weight but held steady. They were good Montana horses, bred for mountains and hard work. They rode in silence. The grassland stretched out around them, endless and golden in the afternoon light. Ezra could feel the tension in Abigail's posture, the way she held herself rigid, maintaining distance, even though they shared the same saddle. She wasn't relaxing. Wouldn't relax for a long time, maybe. Trust was earned, not given, and she'd clearly learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Those men, Abigail said suddenly, her voice close to his ear, they'll come for you now. Probably. You should have left me. Ezra didn't answer immediately. He guided the horse around a cluster of rocks, then up a gentle slope. The land here was familiar, every stone and tree known to him from 4 years of solitary wandering. I tried the mind my own business approach for a while, he said finally. Turns out I'm not very good at it. Most men who help strangers regret it. Most men do a lot of things they regret. They crested the hill and Ezra's camp came into view. It wasn't much and he knew it. A small cabin built from logs he'd cut and hauled himself a smokehouse that leaned slightly to the left, drying racks with pelts stretched across them, and a small corral with 3 horses. Not a ranch, a trapper's camp, built for solitude for a man who wanted to disappear into the mountains and never come back. But it was his. Every board, every fence post represented work and time, and a stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up seemed like the easier path. Abigail's posture shifted slightly as she took in the property. You live alone. 4 years now. No wife, no children. The question landed like a fist to the gut. Ezra's jaw tightened. Had both once, don't anymore. Abigail said nothing, but he felt her nod against his back, a small acknowledgement of shared loss. She understood. Whatever her own story was, she knew what it meant to have had something precious and lost it. They rode into the yard. Ezra dismounted first, then helped Abigail down. She stumbled, slightly exhaustion finally catching up now that immediate danger had passed. Ezra caught her elbow to steady her. There's a place in the smokehouse where you can rest, he said. I'll bring food and water. Abigail looked at the smokehouse, then at the cabin, then back at Ezra. You're not going to ask questions. Figure you'll tell me what you want me to know when you're ready. For the first time since he'd seen her at the creek, something shifted in Abigail's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. Recognition of decency she clearly hadn't expected to find. Thank you, she said quietly. Ezra nodded and turned toward the cabin. Behind him, he heard Abigail's heavy footsteps crossing toward the smokehouse. He paused at his door and looked back. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkening sky, tall and imposing, and impossibly alone. Then she stepped inside, and darkness swallowed her. Ezra went into his cabin and closed the door. He leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. 4 years of quiet. 4 years of keeping his head down, avoiding entanglements, living with ghosts instead of people. And now he'd inserted himself into something that would almost certainly end in blood. He opened his eyes and moved to the window. Through dusty glass, he could see the smokehouse. No light showed from inside. Abigail was already resting or trying to. He wondered how long it had been since she'd felt safe enough to actually sleep. He turned away and started gathering supplies. Bread, dried meat, a jar of preserves, a canteen of fresh water, bandages and salve for the wounds he'd seen. As he worked, his mind turned over the situation like a man examining a piece of wood for flaws. Those three men knew his face now. They knew he'd interfered. Men like that didn't forget. They'd come back looking for revenge or trying to reclaim what they considered their property. Ezra would need to be ready. He gathered the supplies and headed out to the smokehouse. The space smelled of hay and smoke and old wood, familiar and oddly comforting. Ezra paused in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Abigail sat on the cot in the corner, her back against the wall, one hand near a rusted pitchfork that leaned against a beam. She'd positioned herself so she could see both exits. Smart, careful. The behavior of someone who'd learned not to trust, who'd learned that safety was an illusion you maintain through vigilance. Brought food, Ezra said, holding up the bundle. And water, some bandages for that cut. Abigail nodded but didn't move. Her eyes tracked him as he crossed the floor. Ezra set the supplies on a crate near the cot, then backed away, giving her space. "I'll be in the cabin if you need anything," he said. "Wait." The word stopped him. He looked back. Abigail was staring at the bundle of supplies, her expression unreadable. Why, she asked again the same question, but this time there was something different in her voice. Not suspicion. More like genuine bewilderment, as if kindness was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Ezra thought about how to answer. He could give her the easy response, the surface explanation. But that felt hollow, so he told her the truth instead. 4 years ago, my wife Margaret and daughter Ruth were traveling to town when a wheel broke on their wagon. They were stuck on the road for 6 hours in summer heat. 3 different riders passed them. Not one stopped. By the time I found them, Ruth was unconscious from heat stroke. She died 2 days later. Margaret followed a week after. The words came out flat, drained of emotion through repetition, but the pain beneath them was still sharp enough to cut. He'd told this story before to the sheriff, to the neighbors who'd helped bury them, to himself in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. Abigail's face didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, the understanding of someone who carried her own weight of loss. "I can't bring them back," Ezra continued. "Can't change what happened. But I can make damn sure I'm not the person who rides past someone who needs help, even if it costs me." Silence filled the smokehouse. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. The sound seemed to come from very far away. "I'm sorry," Abigail said finally. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "For your loss." Ezra nodded. "Eat, rest. We'll figure out next steps in the morning." This time, when he turned to leave, she didn't stop him. He made it halfway across the floor before her voice reached him again. "I'm from the Shoshone Nation," she said. "My mother was Shoshone. My father was a fur trapper from Ireland. That's why I'm—" She gestured at herself, at her height, at the breadth of her shoulders. "Too big for most people. Not Indian enough for my mother's people. Not white enough for my father's world. Caught in the middle my whole life." Ezra turned back to face her. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, some memory that played out in the shadows. "6 months ago, my father died," Abigail continued. "Fever took him. After that, the men in the trading post where we lived started looking at me different, like I was something they could use now that he wasn't there to protect me. So I ran. Been running ever since. Those 3 men caught me 3 days ago near the border." "You have family anywhere you can go," Abigail shook her head. "My mother died when I was 12. I have cousins among the Shoshone, but I haven't seen them in years. They might not remember me. And even if they did—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. She was too white for her mother's people, too Indian for her father's, caught between worlds with no safe place to land. The convent, she said suddenly. After my father couldn't care for me anymore, he sent me to St. Catherine's Convent in Oregon. I was 15. They took me in when no one else would. I lived there 14 years, became Sister Abigail. I had purpose. What happened? The convent closed 6 months ago, lost funding. The nuns were scattered. Mother Superior gave us all release letters, said we were free to choose new paths. Abigail's hand went to a small bundle beside the cot. My father died 2 months before that. Left me a land deed, 40 acres near the Canadian border. I was traveling there when those men found me. Then you stay here until you're strong enough to decide what comes next, Ezra said. No obligations, no expectations. Abigail met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd seen her at the creek, something like hope flickered across her face. Small, cautious, fragile as new ice. But there. Okay, she said. Thank you, Ezra. He hadn't told her his name, which meant she'd been listening more carefully than he'd realized when the men talked. Smart, observant, a survivor who paid attention to details that might save her life later. Get some sleep, Abigail, he said. He left the smokehouse and walked back to the cabin under a sky filled with stars. Inside, he went through his nightly routine banking, the fire checking the rifles, making sure ammunition was where he could reach it quickly if needed. But tonight felt different. The cabin felt different. For 4 years it had been a tomb, a place where he went to sleep and wake and count hours until sleep came again. Now it felt like something else. A shelter, a sanctuary. Not just for him, but for someone who needed it even more. Ezra lay down on his bed fully clothed, one hand resting on the revolver under his pillow. Sleep came slowly. When he finally slipped under, the last thing he thought about was the way Abigail had said his name. Like she was testing it out. Like she was deciding whether it was a name she could trust. Morning arrived cold and gray. Ezra woke before sunrise and went through his morning tasks with practiced efficiency. Feed the horses, check the water. The physical work helped clear his mind, helped him think through what needed to happen next. Clayton Mercer and his companions would be back. That was certain. The only question was when and how they'd come. Men like that didn't take humiliation lightly. They'd want revenge for the loss of face and as much as for the loss of their captive. Ezra was filling the water trough when he heard the smokehouse door creak open. Abigail emerged into the morning light. She moved stiffly, favoring her left side, but her eyes were clear and alert. She'd washed her face. The blood was gone, revealing the full extent of the bruising. Dark purple spread from her temple down her cheek, the mark of a fist, or maybe a rifle butt. Morning, Ezra said. Abigail nodded. She looked around the camp, taking in details she'd been too exhausted to notice last night. The neat organization of it. The careful maintenance. This wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a home, or as close to a home as a man running from ghosts could build. You need help with anything, she asked. You should rest. I've been resting all night. I'm stronger today. There was pride in her voice, the kind of pride that wouldn't accept weakness, even when weakness would be reasonable. Ezra studied her. Pride stiffened her spine, pushed her shoulders back, despite the pain he knew she must be feeling. He recognized that pride. It was the same kind he'd carried after losing his family, the kind that said, if I stop moving, I'll fall apart, and I can't afford to fall apart. Can you handle a hammer? He asked. Yes. Then help me fix the north fence line. Posts are rotted through. They worked together in silence, falling into an easy rhythm. Ezra would pull out the old posts while Abigail dug new holes and set replacements. She was strong, stronger than any woman he'd known, possibly stronger than most men. When she swung the sledgehammer to drive posts into the hard Montana soil, each strike was solid and true, no wasted motion, just practiced efficiency. By mid-morning, they'd replaced 8 posts and restrung 20 feet of wire. The sun finally broke through the clouds, warming the air. Abigail worked in her torn shirt, seemingly unbothered by the cold that still bit at exposed skin. You learned this from your father, Ezra asked. Some. He taught me how to trap, how to trade, how to read. The physical work I learned from my mother's people. In the Shoshone camps, everyone works. Women build the lodges, process the hides, carry everything when camp moves. You get strong or you don't survive. Your mother teach you to fight, Abigail's hands stilled on the fence post she was setting. Why do you ask? Because you didn't fight back at the creek. 3 men and you didn't even try. Made me wonder if you couldn't fight or if you chose not to. Would you have fought if you knew it meant dying faster? The question hung in the air between them. Ezra thought about it, really thought about it. Finally, he nodded. Fair point. My mother did teach me to fight, Abigail said. But she also taught me when fighting was pointless. Those 3 men, if I'd fought, they would have beaten me unconscious and done whatever they wanted anyway. This way I stayed aware, stayed ready for an opportunity. Until I showed up. Until you showed up, she agreed. They worked in silence for another hour. The fence line gradually took shape straight and solid. Ezra found himself studying Abigail when she wasn't looking. The way she moved, economical and purposeful. The way she scanned the horizon every few minutes, never fully relaxing, always watching for threats. They're coming, Abigail said suddenly. Ezra's head snapped up. He followed her gaze to the eastern ridge. 3 riders, dark shapes against the gray sky, coming at a walk, not hurrying, confident in their numbers and their intent. Get to the smokehouse, Ezra said quietly. There's a rifle under the cot. If shooting starts, use it. I can fight. I know. But right now I need you to be smart instead of brave. If they see you, they'll try to use you against me. Stay hidden. Abigail hesitated, pride warring with pragmatism. Then she nodded and started walking toward the smokehouse, moving quickly, but not running, refusing to show fear even when fear would be the sensible response. Ezra turned to face the approaching riders, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. The Winchester was in the cabin too far to reach without turning his back on them. He had his revolver on his hip, but 3 against 1 at close range wasn't odds he liked. The 3 men reined in their horses 30 yards from the cabin. Clayton was in the lead. The flat-eyed man flanked him. The young one hung back, nervous energy visible in the way he kept shifting in his saddle. Morning, Brennan, Clayton called out. Came to have a conversation. Funny, Ezra said, keeping his voice level. Yesterday you were on my land without permission. Today you're back. That doesn't feel like conversation. That feels like trespass. Yesterday was a misunderstanding. Today we're here to make things right. How's that? Clayton grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. You let us take what's ours, and we forget about that warning shot. Everyone goes their separate ways. Nobody gets hurt. Ezra's hand moved closer to the cabin door, closer to where the Winchester waited just inside. Nothing here belongs to you. That woman does. Sister Abigail's not property. She's a person, and she's under my protection now. The flat-eyed man spoke for the first time, his voice as empty as his gaze. Protection's expensive, Brennan. Costs blood sometimes. You sure you want to pay that price for some half-breed you don't even know? Already paid it when I cut her loose, Ezra said. Question is whether you're ready to pay the price of trying to take her back. Clayton glanced at the flat-eyed man, looking for direction. The calculation was clear on both their faces. They were weighing profit against cost, desire against danger. We got 3 guns to your 1, Clayton said, trying to sound confident. And you ain't even armed. Ezra smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's where you're wrong. I'm always armed. And even if I wasn't, you'd still have a problem. What problem? The one watching you from the smokehouse with a Winchester aimed at your back. All 3 men turned instinctively. Ezra used the distraction to grab the rifle from inside the cabin. By the time they turned back, he had the Winchester up and ready, the stock settled against his shoulder, the barrel trained on Clayton's chest. Now we're having a real conversation, Ezra said. Here's how it goes. You 3 ride out right now today, and you don't come back. Ever. You forget about Sister Abigail. You forget about me. You ride away and find some other trouble to get into, preferably in a different territory. And if we don't, the flat-eyed man asked. His name was Silas Drummond, though Ezra wouldn't learn that until later. Then we find out if you're fast enough to draw before I pull this trigger. And even if you are, you still have to deal with whoever's in that smokehouse. Those odds don't favor you nearly as much as 3 against 1 did. The bluff was working. He could see doubt in Clayton's face, nervousness in the young man's posture. Silas was harder to read, but even he seemed to be reconsidering the mathematics of the situation. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and creek water and the faint metallic scent of coming violence. "This isn't over," Silas said finally. His voice held a promise cold and certain. "You made a choice today, Brennan. You chose wrong." He turned his horse and started riding away. The young man, whose name was Frank Willis, followed immediately, a relief visible in every line of his body. Clayton hesitated, fury twisting his scarred face into something ugly and mean. "You'll regret this," Clayton spat. "Maybe," Ezra said, "but not today." Clayton spat in the direction of the cabin, then wheeled his horse around and kicked it hard, racing to catch up with the others. Ezra kept the rifle up until all three disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower it, hands trembling, slightly from adrenaline and the weight of what had almost happened. Abigail stood in the smokehouse doorway, the rifle clutched in her hands. She'd been ready to shoot if it came to that. The realization settled over Ezra like a weight. This woman who'd taken vows of peace, who'd lived in a convent for 14 years, had been prepared to take a life to protect his. "Thank you," Ezra called out, "for backing me up." "You were bluffing," Abigail said, walking toward him, "about me being in the smokehouse with a rifle." "Part of it, but you were real enough. That's what mattered." She reached him and held out the rifle. Ezra took it, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch lasted only a second, but it felt significant somehow, like a promise being made without words. "They'll come back," Abigail said. "That one with the cold eyes. Silas. He's a killer, a professional." "I know. So what do we do?" Ezra looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, and he realized something. He'd started this thinking he was saving her. But maybe she was saving him too. Saving him from 4 years of empty existence. Saving him from a life that had become nothing more than waiting to die. "We get ready," he said. "We turn this place into something they can't take. And when they come back, we make sure they regret it." Abigail nodded slowly. "Good. Let's get to work." Over the next 3 days, they transformed the camp. They reinforced the cabin windows with heavy shutters that could be barred from inside. They dug shallow rifle pits at strategic points around the perimeter, covering them with branches so they wouldn't be obvious. They stockpiled water in barrels, ammunition in dry places, food that would keep. Abigail proved invaluable. She knew tricks for building defenses, techniques passed down through generations of Shoshone warriors. She showed Ezra how to create tripwires that would make noise if disturbed, using tin cans and taut cords strung at ankle height. She helped construct a hidden exit from the cabin, a crawl space that led to the creek bed 50 yards away. But more than the practical help, Ezra found himself appreciating her company. The cabin felt less empty with her there. They talked while they worked, not constantly, but enough. She told him about growing up between two worlds, never quite belonging to either. About the convent and the strange comfort of a life governed by bells and prayers and routines. About the fear that came when that structure disappeared and she was left adrift. He told her about Margaret and Ruth, about the life they'd built before misfortune tore it apart. About the ranch they'd planned but never finished. About dreams that died along with the dreamers. "You still love them," Abigail observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset over the mountains. "Every day," Ezra admitted. "That's good. Love shouldn't die just because people do." "You ever been in love?" Abigail was quiet for a long time. "Once, a young man from my mother's people. He was kind to me, didn't care that I was half white, but his family forbade it. Said I would bring shame to their bloodline. He obeyed them." She shrugged, but the gesture didn't quite hide the old pain. "That was a long time ago." "His loss," Ezra said. She looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You mean that, yeah, adotio." Something shifted between them, then subtle as creek water changing course, but real. A barrier falling away. They weren't just two people sheltering under the same roof anymore, weren't just allies in a coming fight. They were becoming something more, though neither of them had words for what that something was yet. On the fourth morning, Abigail woke before dawn with anxiety knotting her chest. She dreamed about Silas Drummond. The dream had felt like a warning, the kind her mother used to say came from spirits who wanted to protect you if you'd only listen. She dressed and went outside. Ezra was already up, checking the perimeter defenses they'd built. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Bad dreams." Ezra nodded. "Been getting those myself." Abigail walked to the fence line and looked out at the empty grasslands. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful, peaceful, the kind of morning that made you forget the world could be cruel. Ezra, she said slowly, if something happens today, I want you to know something. Don't talk like that. Listen. She turned to face him. I've been running for 6 months. Running from men who saw me as something to use. Running from places where I didn't belong. And I was starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe there was no space for someone like me in this world. She took a breath. But then you showed up at that creek. You cut those ropes. You treated me like a person, like I mattered. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. The word hung between them in the cool morning air. Ezra felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 4 years starting to thaw. Abigail. He never finished because that's when they heard the gunshot. It came from the east, a single sharp crack that echoed off the mountains. Then another. Then a volley of shots, rapid fire, the sound of multiple weapons being discharged at once. Ezra spun toward the sound. In the distance, maybe half a mile away, he could see smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. That's the Hartley place, he said. Sheriff's ranch. They're creating a distraction, Abigail said, understanding immediately, drawing you away. Or they're actually attacking the Hartleys. Tom has a wife and 2 young sons. More gunshots. The sound of screaming faint but audible across the distance. It could be real. It could be a trick. No way to know without going to look. Go, Abigail said suddenly. I can defend this place. Abigail, go. She grabbed the Winchester, checked that it was loaded. I'll be fine, but those children might not be. I'll be here when you get back. Ezra looked at her, at this impossible woman who'd walked into his life 4 days ago and somehow become the most important thing in it. Then he nodded, grabbed his rifle, and ran for his horse. He rode hard toward the Hartley Ranch, heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. The gunfire was constant now, punctuated by screams that sounded terrifyingly real. He crested the rise overlooking the Hartley property and pulled his horse to a stop, blood running cold. The ranch was empty, no fire, no gunfight, no bodies. Just a phonograph sitting on the porch playing a recording of gunshots and screams. The smoke he'd seen was from wet grass that had been set smoldering, creating the illusion of a building on fire. The whole thing was a setup, an elaborate, carefully planned deception. Ezra yanked his horse around and spurted into a full gallop. 3 miles back to his camp. 3 miles with the terrible certainty growing that he'd been played, that he'd done exactly what they wanted him to do. They'd wanted him gone. Wanted Abigail alone. His camp came into view, and his worst fears materialized. Smoke rose from the smokehouse, real smoke this time, black and thick. 3 horses stood in the yard. 3 men. Ezra didn't slow Marstinium. He charged down the slope at full speed, rifle in one hand, reins in the other. One of the men turned and shouted a warning. Clayton Mercer stood near the burning smokehouse holding a torch. He saw Ezra coming and laughed. Come watch your savage burn, mountain man. Ezra fired from the horseback. The shot went wild, but close enough to make Clayton dive for cover. He hit the ground, running, boots churning up dust as he closed the distance. Silas Drummond stepped out from behind the cabin, revolver drawn, and aimed. Time seemed to slow. Ezra saw Silas's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the muzzle flash, felt the bullet burn past his shoulder so close the heat of its passage left a mark. He rolled, came up with his rifle, and fired. The shot caught Silas in the chest, the impact spinning him like a top. He fell without a sound, the way men fall when death comes quick and certain. Clayton was running for the horses. Frank Willis just stood, frozen hands raised, at all fight gone out of him. Ezra let them go. His attention was fixed on the smokehouse. Flames climbed the walls, eating the dry wood with hungry efficiency. Abigail, he screamed. Abigail! No answer. He ran toward the structure. The main door was barred from the outside. They'd trapped her inside, left her to burn like an animal. Ezra grabbed the bar and heaved. The wood came free and he yanked the door open. Smoke poured out thick and choking. He pulled his bandana over his nose and plunged inside. Abigail, where are you? A cough, weak but there. He followed the sound to the back corner. He found her near the rear wall, collapsed, the Winchester still clutched in her hand. Blood soaked her shirt from a wound in her side. "Shot me," she gasped. "Through the wall." Ezra lifted her, ignoring the scream of protest from his wounded shoulder. She was heavy, solid muscle and bone, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he had. He carried her toward the door as the roof began to crack and groan above them. They burst out into open air seconds before the roof collapsed inward, sending up a column of sparks and ash that climbed toward the sky like a prayer for mercy. Ezra carried Abigail away from the inferno, setting her down in the yard as gently as he could. Her face was gray with pain and smoke inhalation. Blood pumped from the bullet wound in her side, dark and steady. "Stay with me," Ezra said, pressing his hand against the wound. "Don't you dare die on me now." Abigail's eyes fluttered. "Did we win?" "You're alive. That's a win." "Silas dead." "Good." She coughed blood on her lips. "Ezra, save your strength. I'm going to patch you up." "No." Her hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Listen, in my coat pocket, papers. My father's land deed, 40 acres near the Canadian border. If I die, it's yours." "You're not dying." "If I die," she insisted, "it's yours. Build something there. Something good." "Build it yourself," Ezra said roughly, his throat tight. "Because you're not dying, I won't allow it." Abigail smiled, blood on her teeth. "You can't always get what you want, Mountain Man. Watch me." Ezra worked through the night fighting to keep Abigail alive with a desperation that bordered on fury. The bullet had passed clean through her, today missing vital organs but tearing muscle and leaving a wound that bled with stubborn persistence. He cleaned it with whiskey that made her scream through clenched teeth, dug out fragments of fabric the bullet had carried inside, then stitched her with thread meant for repairing saddles. His hands shook, but his stitches held. She slipped in and out of consciousness. During the lucid moments, she told him things. About her childhood split between two worlds that wanted her to choose but wouldn't accept her either way. About her father, Patrick, the Irish trapper, who'd loved her mother enough to marry her despite knowing it would cost him his family back home. About dreams of finding a place where she belonged, where being too tall and too mixed and too different wasn't a burden to carry, but simply who she was. "I think I found it," she whispered at one point, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Right here with you." "Then stay," Ezra said, his voice raw. "Stay and help me rebuild." "Is that a proposal, Mountain Man?" "Maybe, if you live long enough to hear the whole thing." She laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at her stitches. "You're a hard man, Ezra Brennan." "Takes one to know one." By morning, the fever broke. Abigail slept naturally instead of that restless, half-conscious state that had terrified him through the night. Ezra sat beside her bed, his bed, the one he'd given up so she could rest somewhere clean and safe, and watch the sun rise through the cabin window. The smokehouse was gone, reduced to charred timber and ash, but the cabin still stood. The land remained, and so did they, battered and bloodied, but alive. 2 months passed before Abigail was strong enough to ride. The wound healed slowly, leaving a scar that would mark her for life. But scars were proof of survival, she said, proof that whatever tried to kill you had failed. During those 2 months, something deepened between them. Ezra cared for her with a gentleness that surprised them both. Changing bandages, bringing meals, reading aloud from the few books he owned when she was too weak to do anything but listen. Abigail, for her part, let him help without protest, learning to accept care without feeling diminished by it. They talked during the long hours of recovery about everything and nothing, about the lives they'd lost and the lives they might build. The conversations weren't always easy. Sometimes they argued about small things, testing boundaries, learning the shape of each other's stubbornness. But always they came back to the quiet comfort of being understood. The first snow fell on a morning in late October. Ezra stood on the cabin porch watching fat white flakes drift down from a sky the color of old pewter. Behind him, he could hear Abigail moving around inside preparing breakfast. She still favored her right side when the weather turned cold, but she moved with increasing confidence, her strength returning day by day. Behind them, the framework of a new smokehouse was taking shape. They'd started rebuilding together, Ezra cutting timber, while Abigail, still recovering, directed the construction with the kind of practical knowledge that came from watching buildings go up and come down across two cultures. "Coffee's ready," Abigail called from the doorway. Ezra turned toward her and found himself smiling. She wore one of his old shirts, too small on the shoulders, but rolled up to fit, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid that hung past her waist. The bruises had faded. The cuts had healed. She looked strong again, vital, like something that had bent under pressure but refused to break. "You planning to stand out here until you freeze?" she asked. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how much has changed in 2 months." Abigail stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed him one and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Change for the better." "Yeah," Ezra said quietly, "for the better." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform the landscape into something clean and new. The mountains rose white and eternal in the distance, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow reassuring in their permanence. "We've got company," Abigail said suddenly, her eyes on the eastern ridge. A single rider approached, moving slowly through the falling snow. Not threatening, but deliberate. As he got closer, Ezra relaxed slightly. It was Sheriff Tom Hartley, the man whose ranch had been used as bait in the ambush. The sheriff reined in his horse at the edge of the yard and dismounted, his movements careful in the accumulating snow. "Morning, Ezra. Miss Abigail?" "Sheriff," Ezra acknowledged. "What brings you out in this weather?" "News," Hartley said. "Came to deliver it personal-like. Clayton Mercer and Frank Willis. They got caught trying to rob a stage near Helena 3 weeks back. They're in custody now. Frank testified against Clayton in exchange for leniency. Clayton hung 2 days ago. Judge let Frank go with time served and a warning." "And Silas," Abigail asked quietly, "buried him where he fell. No family to claim the body." The sheriff pulled a folded telegram from his coat. "But there's more. This came to my office yesterday. Concerns you, Miss Abigail." Abigail took the paper with hands that trembled slightly. She unfolded it and read, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that might have been grief or might have been relief. "What is it?" Ezra asked. "My uncle," Abigail said, her voice distant. "Cornelius Thorne. He's dead. Heart failure. His lawyer says I'm his sole heir." Sheriff Hartley nodded. "That's what the telegram says. Apparently Cornelius had no other living relatives. Everything he owned goes to you. His mine, his house in Helena, his accounts. According to the lawyer, it's a considerable sum." "But he hated me," Abigail whispered. "He refused to help my father raise me. Called me tainted blood." "Maybe guilt caught up with him," the sheriff said. "His lawyer mentioned there's a letter. Said Cornelius wrote it before he died." He pulled an envelope from his coat and handed it over. "I'll leave you to read it in private. Congratulations, Miss Thorne. You are a wealthy woman now." He mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the curtain of falling snow. Abigail stood holding the envelope like it might bite. Ezra waited, giving her space to process this sudden upheaval. Finally, she broke the seal and pulled out several pages covered in shaky handwriting. "Do you want me to leave?" Ezra asked. "No," Abigail said. "Stay. I might need you." She read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Abigail, if you're reading this, I'm dead. Good riddance, you're probably thinking. You'd be right to think it. I treated you and your father terribly. When Patrick married your mother, I called him a fool and a race traitor. When you were born, I refused to acknowledge you as family. When your mother died and Patrick begged me for help raising you, I turned him away." Her voice caught, but she continued. "Why? Because I'm a coward. I was raised to believe that blood purity mattered more than love. I believed it so deeply that I couldn't admit I was wrong, not even when I saw how it destroyed my brother. Patrick was a better man than I ever was. He loved your mother truly. He loved you completely. And he earned those survey coordinates. He did the work, the hiking, the measuring. I tried to claim them as mine only because I funded the expedition, but they were always his." Abigail's hand tightened on the paper. "I sent Silas Drummond after you not because you stole anything, but because I wanted to keep you from having what I couldn't stand you having. Success, happiness, belonging. But now I'm dying, and none of my hatred kept me warm. None of my money bought me family. I die alone because I chose pride over love." Tears ran down her cheeks now, but she kept reading. "Don't make my mistake, Abigail. Don't let fear or duty or other people's expectations steal your chance at happiness. Your father would want you to live, not just survive. The mine, the house, the money, it's all yours. Do something good with it. Build that school Patrick told me about in his letters. Be the woman he knew you could be." I'm sorry, I know it's too late, but I'm sorry. Cornelius Thorne. Abigail folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it was made of glass. She stood there in the falling snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, and Ezra did the only thing he could do. He wrapped his arms around her and held her while she cried for the father who'd loved her and the uncle who'd finally at the very end tried to make amends. When the tears subsided, she pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held a new kind of clarity. I have resources now, she said. Enough to build that school my father dreamed about. Enough to fund it for years. You do, Ezra agreed. I could hire teachers, builders, staff. I could create a place where children like me, children who don't fit into neat categories, could learn and grow without shame. You could do all of that, Abigail took a breath. Or I could admit that my vows were made by a girl who didn't know what love was, who didn't know she could be faithful to one and faithful to her heart at the same time. She turned to face him, fully taking both his hands in hers. The church says my vows are eternal, she continued, but the convent released me. Mother Superior told us we were free to choose new paths. So what do I choose? Do I choose duty to vows made when I was 15 and terrified and desperate for purpose? Or do I choose something new? What do you want to choose? Ezra asked. I want to choose you, Abigail said simply. I want to choose this life we're building. I want to choose being both things I am, Shoshone and Irish and Catholic and woman and warrior all at once without apology. I want to build that school, yes, but I want to build it with you beside me, as my partner, as my equal, as my husband, if you'll have me. Ezra felt something shift in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 4 years. On one condition, he said. What's that? You never call yourself too big again, or too anything. You're exactly the right size for what you need to be. Abigail laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine. Deal. They kissed, then snow falling around them like a benediction. When they broke apart, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. So what now, he asked. Now we ride to that land my father left me. We see it together. We decide how to build this future, and then we figure out the rest as we go. Sounds like a plan. There's just one problem, Abigail said, a smile tugging at her lips. What's that? It's 80 miles through mountain country in winter. We'll need supplies, warm clothes, good horses. And time, Ezra added, time to do it right. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Ezra traded pelts in town for winter gear, warm coats lined with fur boots that would keep their feet dry through snow and slush. Abigail used some of the money from her inheritance to buy 2 strong horses, Montana-bred animals that could handle the terrain and the cold. The cabin felt different now. Not a tomb where Ezra waited out his days, but a home they were both reluctant to leave even temporarily. They'd made it theirs through shared work and shared danger, through nights spent talking by the fire and days spent rebuilding what had been destroyed. On the morning they left, Ezra stood at the graves of Margaret and Ruth. He knelt and placed his hand on the cold earth. I'm going to try again, he told them quietly. Going to try to build something good. I think you'd approve. I think you'd like her. She's strong like you were, Margaret. She makes me want to be better than I am. He stood and found Abigail waiting by the horses, giving him privacy, but close enough that he didn't feel alone. Ready? She asked. Yeah, Ezra said. I'm ready. They rode north through a landscape transformed by snow. The journey took 7 days, traveling slowly to preserve the horses' strength and camping each night in whatever shelter they could find. Sometimes that meant a stand of pines that blocked the wind. Sometimes it meant caves tucked into hillsides. Once it meant an abandoned trapper's cabin where they waited out a storm that howled through the mountains for 2 days straight. In that cabin, with the storm raging outside and nothing to do but wait, they talked. Really talked. Abigail told him about her time in the convent, about the strange comfort of a life governed by structure and prayer, about the women she'd lived with, some kind and some cruel, and how she'd learned to navigate both, about the moment Mother Superior had told them the convent was closing and how it had felt like the ground dropping out from under her feet. Ezra told her about his life before Margaret and about growing up poor in Missouri, about the war that had taken so many men he'd known, about meeting Margaret at that barn dance and how she'd laughed when he stepped on her feet instead of getting angry, about deciding to move west for a fresh start and how that decision had led to both the best and worst moments of his life. "Do you regret coming to Montana?" Abigail asked. Ezra thought about it. "I regret that they died here, but I don't regret the choice. We had good years before the fever came. Ruth grew up with mountains and sky and freedom most children never know. Margaret loved it here. Said the land made her feel small in a good way, reminded her there were things bigger than her worries." "She sounds wise." She was. Ezra looked at Abigail across the fire. "She'd like you. She always respected strength wherever she found it." The storm trapped them for another day, but Ezra found he didn't mind. There was something peaceful about the enforced stillness, about having nowhere to go and nothing to do but exist together. They played cards with a worn deck Ezra found in a drawer. They took turns reading from a book of poetry someone had left behind. They simply sat in silence, comfortable with each other, in a way that felt both new and ancient. On the third morning, the storm broke. They emerged to find the world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, pristine and untouched. The horses were restless, ready to move after being confined. Ezra and Abigail packed their supplies and continued north. On the seventh day, they crested a final ridge, and the land Patrick Thorne had claimed spread out below them. 40 acres of meadow beside Flathead Lake, a creek running through it clear and cold, a stand of pines providing timber and shelter. Mountains rose behind it like guardians snow-capped and eternal. It was beautiful in a way that made the breath catch. Pristine, untouched, full of possibility. Abigail dismounted and walked down into the meadow. Ezra followed, leading the horses. She knelt in the snow and dug until she found earth, then pressed her hand against it. "My father's land," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He never saw this, died before he could come here and build the life he dreamed of." "But he made sure you could," Ezra said. "That counts for something." They explored together, Abigail pointing out features while Ezra assessed them with a practiced eye. The creek was positioned perfectly high enough to avoid flooding, but accessible for water. The meadow was flat enough for building, but sloped enough for drainage. The pines were old growth, straight and strong, perfect for lumber. "Could support a school," Ezra said. "Or a ranch, or both. Land's good enough for either." Abigail found the survey stakes her father must have placed years before, each one marked with coordinates that matched the deed. The final stake had something extra carved into it. "For Abby, build your future. Pa." She traced the letters with her fingers, tears freezing on her cheeks. Ezra stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, letting her grieve and hope and plan all at once. That night, they camped on the land itself, building a fire in the shelter of the pines. The sky was clear and cold stars scattered across it in numbers that defied counting. "I could build a school here," Abigail said, staring into the flames. "Teach children reading, writing, arithmetic. All the things they'd need to make their way in the world. But also the practical skills. How to grow food, how to build things, how to survive when times get hard." "You'll need a building," Ezra said. "Staff, funding for supplies and food. The Silver Rights could provide that. If we file the mining claims properly, lease the rights to a reputable company, the royalties could fund the school for decades." Abigail looked at him. "I'm not doing this alone. I can't. I need someone who knows this land, who knows how to build in this climate, who can teach the practical skills I don't have. I need a partner." "What kind of partner?" "The permanent kind," Abigail said quietly. "If you're willing." Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "If I stay, it won't be just as a partner in running a school. You know that?" "I know. It means everything changes. Your vows, your relationship with the church, how people see you." "I know that too," Abigail said. "And I'm choosing it anyway. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this life. I'm choosing to be whole instead of divided." Ezra reached across the fire and took her hand. "Then I'm choosing the same thing." They sat like that, hands joined across the flames while the stars wheeled overhead and the future spread out before them like the meadow below, full of possibility and promise and the hard work that turns dreams into reality. The next morning, a rider appeared from the south. They saw him coming from a mile away, a single figure moving purposefully through the snow. Ezra and Abigail both reached for rifles, old instincts dying hard, but the rider carried a white flag tied to a stick. Sheriff Hartley reined in his horse at the edge of their camp. "Thought I might find you here," he said. Got more news. Frank Willis turned himself into a marshal in Billings, testified against Clayton in exchange for leniency. Judge let him go with time served and a warning. Last I heard, he was heading back to Montana looking to start over somewhere his past won't follow. Hartley dismounted and pulled a folder from his saddlebag. There's more. That land dispute man named Foster, who said he'd bought the rights from Cornelius before he died, I did some digging. Turns out Foster has a history of land fraud in 3 territories. His claim won't hold up. The land is legally yours, Miss Thorne, free and clear. He handed her official-looking documents, everything stamped and notarized. 40 acres with mineral rights intact. You can do whatever you want with it. Abigail took the papers with trembling hands. Thank you, Sheriff. There's one more thing. Hartley pulled out a final envelope. Another letter from Cornelius. His lawyer said he wrote it the night before he died, separate from the other one. Said it was important you read it here on this land. He handed it over, tipped his hat, and mounted his horse. I'll leave you to it. Congratulations, Miss Thorne. Mr. Brennan, you two are doing something good here. This territory needs more of that. He rode away, leaving them alone with the letter. Abigail opened it with hands that shook. This one was shorter, the handwriting even more unsteady. Abigail, she read aloud, if you're reading this on Patrick's land, then you made it. I'm glad. Your father and I surveyed this valley together 30 years ago, back before everything went wrong between us. He picked this spot because of the creek and the binons and the way the mountains sheltered it. Said it was a place where a person could build something that would last. Her voice caught. He was right. Build your school here, Abigail. Fill it with children who don't fit the narrow definitions other people try to force on them. Teach them they don't have to choose between the parts of themselves. Teach them they can be whole. Your father would be so proud. I wish I could be, but I wasted that chance. Don't waste yours. Cornelius. Abigail folded the letter and tucked it carefully into her coat. She looked at Ezra with eyes that held both grief and determination. We build it here, she said. The school. We build it exactly here. Then we better get started, Ezra said. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. They spent 2 more days on the land marking out where the school building would go, where their cabin would sit, where the gardens and outbuildings would be placed. They worked together with an ease that came from shared purpose, from knowing they were building something larger than themselves. On the ride back to Ezra's camp, they talked about practical matters. When to start construction, how to hire workers, whether to lease the mineral rights immediately or wait until the school was established. But underneath the practical talk ran a current of something deeper. They were planning a life together, a real life, a future that stretched beyond survival into actual living. By the time they reached Ezra's cabin, winter had fully settled over Montana. The snow was 3 feet deep in places, the creek frozen solid. They spent the dark months preparing Ezra, working on architectural plans, while Abigail wrote to potential teachers, contacted mission societies about funding research curricula that would serve children from multiple cultural backgrounds. In December, on a day when the temperature never rose above freezing, a traveling Methodist minister named Reverend Samuel Price stopped at their cabin seeking shelter for the night. Over dinner, Abigail asked him a question. Reverend, do you perform marriage ceremonies? I do, miss. You know a couple in need of marrying. We are that couple, Abigail said, looking at Ezra. If you're willing to marry us. Reverend Price studied them both carefully. You're the former nun folks have been talking about. I was a nun, Abigail said. Mother Superior released me when the convent closed. I'm free to marry if I choose. And you choose this man. I do. The Reverend turned to Ezra. And you understand what you're taking on? This won't be an easy life. People will judge her, judge you, judge any children you might have. Let them judge, Ezra said. I've spent 4 years caring what people think, and it nearly killed me. I'm done with that. If Abigail will have me, I'll count myself the luckiest man in Montana. Reverend Price smiled. Then I'll marry you tomorrow morning if you'd like. Do you want to write your own vows? They spent the evening crafting words that would bind them together. Not traditional vows, but something true to who they were and what they'd survived to reach this moment. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sheriff Hartley and his wife Emma arrived to serve as witnesses, having ridden through the night when word reached them. The ceremony took place in front of the cabin, snow falling gently around them. Abigail wore a simple blue dress, practical and warm. Ezra wore his best vest, cleaned and pressed. They stood facing each other while Reverend Price spoke the traditional words, then stepped aside to let them speak their own. "I promise to be your equal partner," Ezra said, holding Abigail's hands, "to respect your strength and support your dreams, to stand beside you in building and fighting, to love you with all that I am and all that I will become." "I promise to be your equal partner," Abigail replied, her voice strong and clear, "to bring both my strength and my faith into the home we build, to create a life where all parts of who I am can exist together, to teach any children we're blessed with that they never have to choose between what they are, and to love you with all I have been and all I am becoming. Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Price said. "Ezra, you may kiss your bride." They kissed as snow fell around them, two people who'd been broken by loss finding wholeness in each other. That night, lying together in the cabin that had become their home, Abigail spoke into the darkness. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Of what comes next?" "Terrified," Ezra admitted, "but also hopeful. First time in 4 years I've felt hope about the future." "Me too," Abigail whispered. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. Not just the parts that fit what people expect from a woman or a nun or a half-breed. All of it. Thank you for that." Ezra pulled her closer. "That's what love is, I think. Seeing someone whole and choosing them anyway. Choosing them because of who they are, not despite it." Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, wrapped in quilts and each other's warmth, Ezra and Abigail Brennan began their life together. Spring came late that year, winter reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. But when it finally arrived, it came with a rush. Snow melted into rivers, meadows turned green almost overnight, and the world felt new again. In March, they began construction on the school. Ezra hired local workers, and to his surprise, Frank Willis appeared one morning, hat in hand, asking for work. "I know I got no right to ask," Frank said, "after what I did, but I'm trying to be better, trying to make amends. If you'll have me, I'll work harder than anyone." Ezra looked at Abigail. She studied Frank for a long moment, then nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to choose differently," she said. "Welcome, Frank." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret it." And they didn't. Frank worked as if trying to atone for his role in the attack through sheer effort, always first to arrive and last to leave. The school took shape slowly but surely. A single large room for the main classroom, a smaller room for a library, a workshop for teaching practical skills, and a kitchen where students could learn to cook and preserve food. Nothing fancy but solid, built to last. While the building went up, Abigail traveled to nearby towns, posting notices about the school. Open to all children, regardless of race, creed, or circumstance. The notices read, "Education in reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills. No tuition required." The responses were mixed. Some people praised the initiative. Others condemned it, saying she was encouraging race mixing and godlessness. Abigail ignored both praise and condemnation, with equal grace, focused entirely on the work. By late summer, the school was finished. A sign went up over the door, "Thorne Brennan School for All Children." Below it in smaller letters, no one turned away. On the first day of September 1879, Abigail stood at the door of the school, nervous despite herself. Ezra stood beside her. "What if no one comes?" she asked. "Then we wait," Ezra said, "and we try again." 8 o'clock came and went. No students. 8:15, still empty. Abigail was beginning to think they'd built a school for ghosts when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. A farmer named Thomas Reed arrived with his son Matthew, 8 years old and unable to read. Then came a German family with 3 children, a Shoshone couple with 2 daughters, a Chinese widow whose husband had died building the railroad, bringing her son Lee. By 9 o'clock, 7 children sat in the classroom ranging in age from 6 to 12. And then came one more. Mary Whitfield, 12 years old, arrived alone. No parents, no explanation. She was tall for her age, taller than seemed right awkward in her own skin. She stopped at the door, uncertain. Abigail approached her. "Hello, what's your name?" "Mary, but everyone calls me Too Tall Mary." Abigail smiled, warm and understanding. She knelt to the girl's eye level, despite Mary being nearly as tall as she was. "I used to be called too big," Abigail said. "Want to know a secret?" Mary nodded. "There's no such thing as too anything. You're exactly who you're meant to be. And here that's enough. More than enough." Tears welled in Mary's eyes. Abigail extended her hand. "Come inside. We have work to do." Mary took her hand and stepped across the threshold into a place where she could belong. The school found its rhythm quickly. Mornings were devoted to traditional subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, Bible study. Afternoons belonged to Ezra, who taught practical skills passed down through generations of mountain men and trappers. How to read weather signs, how to find water, how to build shelter, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. The children learned English but were encouraged to share their own languages too. The German children taught counting in German. The Shoshone girls taught words for plants and animals. Li Chen taught basic Mandarin. Mary Whitfield, who'd seemed so uncertain that first day, blossomed into a natural teacher herself, helping younger students with reading. It wasn't perfect. There were challenges. A father removed his son for 2 weeks, angry that the boy sat next to Indians. The boy came back on his own, having walked 3 miles, saying his mother had overruled his father. Winter came to schools first. They kept it open through the cold months, though attendance dropped when snow made travel difficult. But even with only 3 or 4 students on the worst days, Abigail and Ezra taught. Education didn't stop for weather. It was during this quiet winter that Abigail realized she was pregnant. She told Ezra one evening in January, the two of them alone in their cabin while wind howled outside. "I'm with child," she said simply. Ezra's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Joy, fear, wonder, grief for the daughter he'd lost, hope for the child to come. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. 3 months along, I think. The baby will come in summer." He pulled her close, resting his hand on her belly where new life was forming. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," Abigail admitted, "but also hopeful. Is that foolish?" "No," Ezra said. "That's human. That's what it means to keep living even after loss. To dare to hope again, despite knowing how much it can hurt." Their child, a daughter they named Ruth Margaret, was born in July of 1880. The birth was long and difficult, Abigail's unusual height making for complications, but both mother and daughter survived. The baby was healthy, strong, lunged with dark hair, like her mother, and her father's gray eyes. Ezra held his daughter and wept, grieving the child he'd lost while celebrating the one he'd been given. Life and death, loss and hope, all tangled together in ways that couldn't be separated. The school continued to grow. By its second year, they had 15 students. By the third, 22. Some boarded with local families during the week, traveling home on weekends. Others made the daily journey, some walking miles each way for an education. Mary Whitfield, now 15, became Abigail's assistant teacher. She had a gift for working with younger children, a patience that came from remembering her own struggles. She planned to take teacher training when she turned 18, then return to teach full-time. Frank Willis became the school's handyman and Ezra's assistant in teaching practical skills. He'd found redemption through service, and though he never spoke much about his past, his dedication spoke for itself. In the spring of 1882, a new challenge emerged. A delegation from Kalispell arrived, 5 women led by Judith Crane, a sharp-faced woman who'd made it her mission to police morality in the territory. "We're here to inspect the school," Judith announced, walking into the classroom without invitation during afternoon lessons. "There have been complaints." Abigail, who'd been working with younger students, came to the doorway. "Complaints about what?" "About the mixing of races, about improper religious instruction, about whether children are being taught proper Christian values or being corrupted by heathen influences." The students, a mix of white, Chinese, Shoshone, and German children, sat frozen at their desks. Abigail could see the shame beginning to creep into their expressions, the old familiar sense that something was wrong with them for being different. She stepped forward, placing herself between the women and her students. "These children are being taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, science, and Bible study from the King James Bible." Abigail said, her voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "They're learning practical skills that will help them survive in this territory, and they're learning that being different doesn't make them less than anyone else. If that's corruption in your eyes, Mrs. Crane, then I'm proud to be a corrupter." Judith's face flushed red. You have no right to speak to me that way. I'm a respectable woman from a respectable family. And I'm a woman who spent 14 years in service to God, who married a good man, and who's devoted her life to educating children that people like you would rather see ignorant and ashamed. Abigail interrupted. Respectability isn't determined by who your parents were or what your name is. It's determined by what you do with the life you're given. One of the other women stepped forward, her expression less hostile. Mrs. Brennan, we're not trying to shut down your school. We just want to make sure the children are being properly cared for. Then look around, Abigail said, gesturing to the classroom. Look at their faces. Look at their work. Talk to them if you'd like. Ask them if they're being mistreated or corrupted. The woman did look, her gaze moving from student to student. They looked back at her with clear eyes and straight spines, not cowering, but not defiant either. Just children learning and growing. Mary Whitfield stood up from where she'd been helping a younger student. I can tell you about this school if you'd like, ma'am. I've been here since the first day it opened. I was 12 then, too tall for my own good, ashamed of myself for being different. Mrs. Brennan taught me that being tall wasn't something to apologize for. She taught me to read and write and think. She taught me that I could be a teacher myself one day. If that's corruption, then I'm grateful for it. The woman's expression softened. She turned to Judith. I don't see anything wrong here. Of course you don't, Judith snapped. You always were too soft. The only confusion I see, Ezra said quietly, speaking for the first time, is in people who can't tell the difference between education and corruption. These children are learning. They're thriving. If that offends you, the door's right there. Judith and her delegation left in a huff, but the damage was done. The students were shaken, reminded that the outside world didn't always approve of what they were building here. That night, after the children were in bed, Abigail sat in the main classroom, staring at the empty desks. Maybe they're right, she said when Ezra found her. Maybe I'm asking too much, trying to change things that can't be changed. The world's already changing, Ezra said, sitting beside her. We're just helping it along. And those children in there, they're going to grow up knowing they don't have to hide who they are. That's worth all the Judith Cranes in Montana. Spring brought another trial. In late April, a 10-year-old boy named Robert Mason disappeared after afternoon lessons. He'd been walking home when he wandered off trail following elk tracks out of curiosity. By the time his parents arrived at the school, frantic, the boy had been missing for 3 hours. Ezra organized a search immediately. He found tracks leading north into the mountains and followed them for 3 hours using every skill he'd learned in decades of trapping. He found Robert sitting under a pine tree, crying and terrified. I'm sorry, Robert sobbed. I know you taught us never to leave the trail, but I wanted to see where the elk went, and then I didn't know which way was home. Ezra wrapped the boy in his coat and carried him back. You remembered to stay in one place when you realized you were lost. That's the most important thing. The next day, Ezra changed his afternoon curriculum. Every student, regardless of age, would learn comprehensive survival skills. How to read the sun for direction. How to follow water downhill. How to build emergency shelter. How to signal for help. These skills could save your lives, he told them. Pay attention. The incident brought unexpected support. Robert's parents, who'd considered pulling him from school instead, became advocates. Other families heard the story and sent their children, trusting that a school that taught such practical wisdom was worth the social controversy. By the school's 5th year, they'd settled into a sustainable rhythm. 20 to 25 students each term, 2 teachers after they hired Miss Eleanor Hartwell from Boston, Frank Willis maintaining the buildings. Mary Whitfield had left for Teachers College in Helena, but wrote regularly, planning to return. In November of 1884, Harrison Greaves from the Montana Mining Consortium returned with a new offer. $10,000 for mineral rights, he said. That's double our previous offer. Abigail didn't hesitate. And what would you do with the land? Extract the silver, build processing facilities, standard operations. And the creeks, Greaves hesitated. Some diversion might be necessary. No, Abigail said firmly. That creek is our only water source. The children drink from it. No amount of money is worth risking their health. That's very idealistic, Mrs. Brennan. $10,000 would secure your school's future. Our school's future is already secure, Abigail said. We'll find another way. The mining representative left, and Abigail felt relief wash over her. They'd chosen principles over profit. Some things couldn't be bought. The answer to their funding needs came from an unexpected source. In June of 1885, a letter arrived from the Methodist Mission Society. They'd heard about the school through Reverend Price and wanted to provide ongoing support. Not a fortune, but enough to hire additional staff and expand the library. There was one condition: the school would maintain its Christian character. No problem, Abigail wrote back. They'd been doing that from the beginning. Spring of 1885 brought visitors Abigail hadn't expected. 3 Shoshone elders traveling from a reservation 200 miles south arrived with a request. Could the school take in 10 Shoshone children whose families had been displaced, children who needed education but wouldn't receive it on the reservation? Abigail looked at her school already near capacity, looked at her budget stretched thin, looked at Ezra, who nodded. Yes, she said, we'll make room. They built a 3rd dormitory. The Methodist Mission Society increased funding. Other donors emerged. The 10 Shoshone children arrived in June, among them a boy named Daniel Running Wolf, 12 years old, who spoke almost no English. Abigail worked with him personally, teaching English while relearning Shoshone words from her childhood. He was bright and hungry for knowledge. My mother says education is survival, Daniel told her months later in halting English. She says I must learn the white man's ways to protect our people. Your mother is wise, Abigail said, but don't forget your people's ways either. You'll need both. By autumn, Daniel was reading at grade level and teaching younger students basic Shoshone. Another child saved from being lost between worlds. The years accumulated, each bringing challenges and triumphs. A smallpox scare that closed the school for 3 weeks. A harsh winter that tested everyone's resolve. A mining company's final attempt to buy the land, offering $15,000, which Abigail refused without hesitation. This land is for the children, she told their representative. It will always be for the children. Through it all, the school grew, not just in size, but in reputation. Educators from other territories visited, wanting to understand how they made it work. Abigail's answer was always the same. You teach each child as they are, not as you wish they were. You honor where they come from while preparing them for where they're going. And you never ever make them choose between the parts of themselves. In October of 1885, Jake Hodge, a 16-year-old troublemaker, rode up to the school looking for his younger brother Timothy. He found the students outside during break, and his eyes settled on Mary Whitfield, who'd returned from teacher's college. Well, look at this, he drawled. The giant's still here. You ever stop growing, girl? Mary's face went red. She was tall, taller even than she'd been at 12. But she'd grown into it, learned to carry her height with grace. Hannah Collins, a small, fierce 8-year-old whose mother worked in the kitchen, stepped forward. Leave her alone, Jake laughed. What are you going to do about it, runt? Before Hannah could respond, Abigail emerged from the school building. She walked across to the yard with deliberate calm, steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. That's enough, she said. Jake turned to her. Abigail stood 6'1", taller than Jake by 3 inches. I was just funning. No, Abigail interrupted, her voice quiet but absolute. You were being cruel. Making someone else feel less doesn't make you more. It just makes you less in the ways that actually matter. Jake's face reddened. You can't talk to me like that. I just did. And now you're going to apologize to Mary, collect your brother if he wants to go and leave. Abigail took one step forward, bringing herself to her full height. She didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten, just looked at him with an expression that said she'd dealt with far worse. Jake took a step back. Whatever, she's not worth it anyway. He left without Timothy, who'd decided to stay. When he was gone, Abigail knelt beside Mary. Are you all right? Mary nodded, tears on her face. I thought I was past caring what people like him said. We never get completely past it, Abigail said gently. The words still sting, but you get better at remembering they're wrong. You are exactly the right size, Mary, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth your tears. Hannah hugged Mary fiercely. You're the best teacher I ever had, and you're beautiful. Mary laughed through her tears. Thank you, Hannah. That night, Abigail told Ezra about the incident. We're breaking cycles here, she said. Every child we teach kindness, that they don't have to hate people for being different. That's one more person who might raise their children better. It's slow work, Ezra said. The best work usually is. In 1888, 10 years after the school's founding, they held a celebration. 40 students, now 3 teachers, a thriving garden livestock that provided milk and eggs. Former students returned. Mary Whitfield came from her teaching position in Billings, wanting to see how far the school had come. "You did this," Mary told Abigail, looking at the children playing the buildings that had multiplied the gardens and workshops. "You built something that will outlast all of us." "We built it," Abigail corrected, "all of us together." That night, Abigail and Ezra sat on their cabin porch watching the sun set. Their daughter Ruth, now 8, was at the school helping prepare for tomorrow's lessons. "Do you ever regret it?" Ezra asked. "Refusing the mining money, we could have been wealthy." "No," Abigail said. "We're rich in ways that matter. Look at what we've built, not buildings but futures. Lives changed. That's wealth that lasts." Ezra took her hand. "Your father would be proud." "Both of them," Abigail said. "Patrick for dreaming it, Cornelius for making it possible at the end." The years continued. Daniel Running Wolf graduated and went to college. Mary Whitfield opened her own school in Billings. Hannah Collins became a writer publishing stories about frontier education. The Thorne Brennan School became a model copied across the territory. 17 years later, in 1905, an elderly Ezra Brennan sat on that same porch. He was 62 now, hair gray, body slower, but still strong. Abigail was 56, still teaching, despite the aches that came with age. The school had expanded. 70 students, 5 teachers, a reputation that drew children from across Montana. A young man approached on horseback, military uniform crisp. He dismounted and saluted. Ezra recognized him immediately. "Mr. Brennan," Daniel Running Wolf said, "I'm shipping out next week. Before I go, I wanted to thank you and Mrs. Brennan properly." "For what?" "For saving my life. I was 12 and lost when I came here, caught between being Shoshone and being American. You taught me I could be both." Abigail emerged from the school building. Daniel saluted her. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to officer candidate school after this tour. First Shoshone officer in my unit's history. My mother says to tell you she was right. Education is survival, and you gave me the tools to survive." Tears filled Abigail's eyes. "We didn't give you anything you didn't already have, Daniel. We just showed you it was there." "That was everything," Daniel said simply. He stayed for dinner, sharing stories of the 23 years since he'd left, the college he'd attended, the career he'd built, the younger siblings he'd helped educate. After he left, Ezra found Abigail standing at the window looking at the school grounds. "You all right?" he asked. "Just thinking about that day at the creek. When you cut those ropes and asked if I had somewhere to go, I said no, and you said I could come to your camp. I remember. This is what came from that moment. This school, these children. Daniel becoming an officer. Mary teaching in 3 schools. Hannah writing books. All the lives we touched because you decided to care when caring wasn't convenient." Ezra wrapped his arms around her. "We decided. Together." "Yes," Abigail said softly. "Together." They stood there as the sun set, 2 people who'd been broken by loss and rebuilt through purpose, watching the legacy they'd created. The school would outlast them both, would teach children they'd never meet in years they'd never see. But the foundation was solid, built on the principle that every child deserved education, deserved belonging, deserved the chance to be whole. Built on the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion was simply treating people with dignity. Teaching children they didn't have to choose between the parts of themselves. Showing them that different didn't mean less. As darkness fell and lights came on in the dormitories, the sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard. Learning was happening. Lives were being changed. The future was being built one student at a time. And in their cabin, Ezra and Abigail Brennan held each other close, grateful for the years they had been given, for the work they'd accomplished, for the love that had sustained them through everything. The woman who'd been called too big had found exactly where she fit. The mountain man who'd buried his heart had learned to feel again. Together, they'd built something that would endure. Legacy. Hope, redemption, the things that mattered most.